Number 1. Daniel Wozniak, the actor who killed his neighbor for combat savings. There are crimes that seem, on their surface, impossible to explain. Moments where the comfortable ordinariness of everyday life peels back to reveal something deeply troubling underneath. The case of Daniel Patrick Wozniak is one of those cases. To the people who knew him, Danny Wozniak was an affable, likable young man with a genuine gift for performance. He had spent years building a modest but meaningful life on the community theater stages of Orange County, California, earning the kind of warm local recognition that comes from playing lead roles in musicals and charming audiences night after night. He was funny, he was personable, and by the spring of 2010, he was engaged to a woman named Rachel Buffett, a fellow actress who shared his passion for the stage. From the outside, they looked like a perfectly matched couple with a bright future ahead. The reality, however, was something entirely different, and it was a reality that Daniel Wozniak had worked very hard to keep hidden from everyone around him. By May of 2010, Wozniak was in serious financial trouble. He had no steady employment. He was behind on rent at his Costa Mesa apartment, and he and Rachel were just weeks away from their planned wedding day. The honeymoon had already been discussed, the venue had already been booked, and the cost of it all was pressing down on him in a way he had no legitimate means of addressing. What Daniel Wozniak did next would expose not just a capacity for ruthless calculation, but a willingness to destroy the lives of people who had done nothing but treat him with friendship and trust. His neighbor, Samuel Eliezer Hare, was a 26-year-old United States Army veteran who had served in Afghanistan and returned home with something rare in his age group: financial discipline. Sam Hare had carefully saved a substantial sum from his combat pay, roughly $60,000, and that money was sitting in his apartment, just steps away from Wozniak's own front door. Wozniak knew about it, and Wozniak decided that he wanted it. The plan that Wozniak constructed was calculated down to its smallest detail. He approached Sam Hare with a completely fabricated story, telling him that he needed help moving theatrical equipment from the attic of a nearby rehearsal space at the Los Alamitos Joint Forces training base. Sam, who was a generous and trusting person by all accounts, agreed to help. He followed Wozniak to the location without suspicion, because there was no reason in the world for him to suspect that the man he considered a friendly neighbor had any intention of harming him. Once they were inside the attic space, Wozniak ensured that Sam Hare would never leave. Sam was 26 years old. He had survived a combat tour overseas and returned home to build a civilian life. He died in a dark attic in Orange County because a man he trusted had decided that his savings were worth more than his life. What happened next revealed the true depth of Wozniak's cold-blooded thinking. Rather than stop at what he had already done, he immediately pivoted to covering his tracks in a way that would implicate Sam Hare in a crime Sam had nothing to do with. He used Sam's phone to contact Sam's friend, a 23-year-old college student and dancer named Juri Kibuishi, sending her text messages that made her believe Sam wanted to see her. When Julie arrived at Sam's apartment that same evening, trusting the messages she had received, Wozniak was waiting. Julie Kibuishi was 23 years old. She was, by every account from those who knew her, someone full of warmth and creative energy, the kind of person who lit up rooms. She had no idea what had happened to Sam, and she had no reason to fear what she was walking into. That night, after it was over, Daniel Wozniak drove to the theater, took the stage, and performed the lead role in a musical called Nine. He sang, he took his bow, and he received his applause. The following days, he used Sam Hare's ATM card to withdraw money from Sam's account, enlisting a teenager to make some of the transactions. He accessed Sam's bank funds and used the cash to begin covering wedding expenses. He spent approximately 6 days living with what he had done before investigators began closing in. The break in the case came when Sam's father, Steve Hare, went to his son's apartment and discovered Julie Kibuishi's body. Sam remained missing. Investigators quickly identified Wozniak as a person of interest, and within days they had enough to arrest him. Police took Wozniak into custody on May 28, 2010, the very day he had been scheduled to get married. The investigation that followed was thorough and methodical. Detectives worked to reconstruct every step of Wozniak's planning, recovering evidence from the theater location, from Sam's apartment, and from the financial records connected to the ATM withdrawals. A 16-year-old boy who had helped Wozniak access the ATM testified about being approached and paid to use the card. Wozniak's own videotaped confession, in which he told detectives the motive had been money, became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. The confession was stark and revealing. Wozniak spoke about needing money, about the plan taking shape in his mind, and about carrying it through. His fiancée, Rachel Buffett, initially told investigators she had no knowledge of the killings, but she was eventually charged separately with lying to police and acting as an accessory after the fact. She was later convicted and sentenced to 32 months in prison. The trial of Daniel Wozniak was a lengthy and deeply serious proceeding that took years to reach its conclusion. Prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including the allegation of murder for financial gain. The evidence against him was substantial: his own confession, the testimony of witnesses, forensic evidence from the scene, and the trail of financial activity that followed the killings. His defense team attempted to challenge the case on various grounds, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. On December 16, 2015, a jury convicted Daniel Wozniak on all charges. In January 2016, the same jury recommended the death penalty. On September 23, 2016, Orange County Superior Court Judge John Conley formally sentenced Wozniak to death. During sentencing, Judge Conley spoke directly about what Wozniak had done, noting that at the cost of 2 human lives, he had chosen to pursue a wedding and honeymoon rather than seek a less expensive path or delay his plans. Steve Herr, Sam's father, appeared at the sentencing alongside fellow veterans who had served with Sam. A letter from Sam's commanding officer in Afghanistan was read aloud, describing Sam as a natural leader of high character. Julie Kibuishi's family spoke of a young woman who had been taken from them for no reason she could have anticipated or prevented. Both families had to sit in a courtroom and hear the full account of how their loved ones had been used as pieces in another person's financial calculation. California has maintained a moratorium on executions since 2006, and Wozniak remains on death row at the California Medical Facility, his sentence formally in place but its application suspended indefinitely. The families of Sam Herr and Julie Kibuishi have continued to live with the consequences of what Daniel Wozniak chose to do on a spring afternoon in 2010 because he wanted $60,000 and did not want to cancel his wedding. The case of Daniel Wozniak stands as a deeply studied example of what investigators and prosecutors describe as murder for financial gain, a category of crime in which the victim's life is assigned a monetary value by the perpetrator and found to be worth less than the money they possess. Sam Herr had earned his savings through military service in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. Julie Kibuishi had done nothing at all except respond to a text message she believed came from a friend. Wozniak's community theater career, his performances, his apparent warmth and likability, none of it was a reflection of any genuine humanity toward the people around him. Investigators, prosecutors, and those who covered the case extensively have all noted that Wozniak's ability to perform on-stage hours after committing the acts that ended 2 lives speaks to a level of detachment that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. He performed, he took his bow, and then he waited to see whether he had gotten away with it. He had not. Number 2. Liam McAtasney, the childhood friend who killed Sarah Stern for her inheritance. Some of the most disturbing true crime cases in American history are not the ones involving strangers. They are the ones where the perpetrator sat at the victim's dinner table, grew up on the same street, attended the same school, and was trusted completely because the relationship had a history measured in years or even decades. The case of Liam McAtasney and Sarah Stern is exactly that kind of case, and it is the reason why it captured the attention of the country so completely when it finally came to light. Liam McAtasney had known Sarah Stern since they were approximately 6 years old. They had grown up together in the Neptune City, New Jersey area, attended the same schools, shared the same social circles, and maintained a friendship that had lasted well into their late teens. When Sarah Stern disappeared on the night of December 2, 2016, Liam McAtasney was among those who expressed concern and participated in the public expressions of worry that followed. He was, as far as anyone around him could tell, a grieving friend. In reality, he was the reason she was gone. To understand what drove Liam McAtasney to do what he did, it is necessary to understand what he believed he stood to gain. Sarah Stern's mother had passed away from cancer in 2013, leaving Sarah with an inheritance that was held in her home. McAtasney had become aware of this money. Prosecutors believe he discovered it when he was present at Sarah's family's second home in Avon by the Sea, and she showed him a box of cash that contained a note explaining it was part of what her mother had left behind. According to the testimony of McAtasney's own roommate, Preston Taylor, who cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, McAtasney looked at what he saw in that box and described Sarah as someone who had the kind of money that people would do terrible things to obtain. From that moment forward, the prosecution argued, McAtasney began to plan. The planning took approximately 6 months. McAtasney discussed the scheme with Taylor, his roommate at the time, going through various options for how to access Sarah's money, how to conceal what happened to her, and how to ensure that nothing could be traced back to them. According to Taylor's testimony, the original concept had been to take advantage of Sarah's trust in social situations and steal the money without direct confrontation. As the plan evolved, it became something far more serious. Taylor testified that the two men specifically decided together how Sarah would be harmed and what would be done with her body afterward to prevent detection. The depth of that premeditation, the fact that this planning took place over an extended period of time, between two people who spoke openly about it, was among the most disturbing elements of the case when it was finally presented to a jury. On the afternoon of December 2, 2016, Liam McAtasney spent time with Sarah at her home in Neptune City. She had gone to the bank earlier that day and withdrawn a sum of money. The two of them returned to Sarah's house together, and it was there that McAtasney carried out what he and Taylor had planned. Sarah Stern was 19 years old. She had grown up with Liam McAtasney. She had no reason to fear him. That evening, McAtasney timed what he did with the stopwatch function on his mobile phone, a detail that emerged from a secretly recorded conversation that would ultimately break the case wide open. He took 2 safes from Sarah's home, believing they contained somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. In fact, they contained approximately $8,000. Sarah's body was carried to her car. Later that night, both McAtasney and Taylor drove to the Belmar Bridge above the Shark River and disposed of Sarah's body. They staged the scene to suggest a possible suicide, leaving Sarah's borrowed car at the bridge. Sarah Stern's body has never been recovered. Her disappearance set off an investigation, a public search, and an outpouring of concern from the community, all of which McAtasney participated in while knowing exactly what had happened and where the responsibility lay. For 2 months following Sarah's disappearance, McAtasney went about his life, communicated normally with friends, and gave no visible indication of what he had done. The case appeared to be heading toward an unsolved status, and the police, despite their suspicions, lacked the evidence to move forward. Then Anthony Curry changed everything. Anthony Curry was a mutual acquaintance of McAtasney, who had been approached by law enforcement after expressing his own concerns about McAtasney's behavior in the weeks following Sarah's disappearance. Curry had heard McAtasney speak about his plans on Thanksgiving night. Roughly a week before Sarah went missing, and had dismissed it at the time as bravado. When Sarah actually disappeared, Curry went back to that conversation. Working with investigators, Curry agreed to secretly record a conversation with McAtasney, wearing a concealed device to capture whatever McAtasney chose to say. During that recording, McAtasney described what he had done to Sarah in enough detail to constitute what prosecutors would later argue was a confession. He spoke about the amount of time it took. He spoke about how much money he had expected to find and how much was actually there. He described disposing of her body. He expressed no remorse. Liam McAtasney was arrested in February 2017. Preston Taylor was also arrested and subsequently pleaded guilty to his role in the crime, agreeing to testify against McAtasney in exchange for a sentence of 18 years. McAtasney pleaded not guilty and maintained that innocence throughout his trial, which began in February 2019 in Monmouth County Superior Court. During the trial, jurors were shown the secretly recorded video of McAtasney's conversation with Anthony Curry, which the prosecution argued made his involvement undeniable. Taylor took the stand and described the planning in detail, explaining how the two men had discussed exactly what to do and had made specific decisions together about every element of the scheme. The defense argued that the recorded conversation was not a genuine confession, but rather McAtasney exaggerating and performing for Curry. The jury rejected that argument decisively. After just one day of deliberations, the jury found Liam McAtasney guilty on all 7 counts he faced, including first-degree murder, felony murder, robbery, conspiracy to commit murder, disturbing and desecrating human remains, hindering apprehension, and tampering with physical evidence. On June 21, 2019, Liam McAtasney appeared before Judge Richard English for sentencing. Sarah's father, Michael Stern, delivered a victim impact statement dressed in purple, Sarah's favorite color, and told the court that his life had been in turmoil since the day his daughter disappeared, that he had suffered from recurring nightmares, and that the loss of his only child was something he would carry for the rest of his life. McAtasney was given the opportunity to address the court, but chose to remain silent. Judge English sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 consecutive years on the other charges. The judge credited Anthony Curry publicly, stating that without Curry's decision to work with law enforcement, this case could very well have remained cold and unsolved forever. Preston Taylor received 18 years. The case of Liam McAtasney and Sarah Stern prompted a national conversation about the nature of trust between people who have grown up together, about the way that greed can inhabit the mind and grow into something that overrides every human instinct toward decency, and about the role that ordinary community members can play in bringing justice to cases where evidence is scarce. Anthony Curry's decision to wear a recording device and engage McAtasney in a conversation that could have gone any number of directions was, by the judge's own assessment, the act that delivered justice to Sarah Stern's family. Sarah's body has never been found. Her father continues to live without closure on that specific point, without a physical place to visit, without the finality that a burial can provide. The Shark River carries no answers. What the case does provide is a clear and thoroughly documented record of exactly what Liam McAtasney chose to do, and why, and how much he expected to gain from it. He expected up to $100,000. He got $8,000. He is now serving life in a New Jersey prison with no possibility of ever being released. Number 3. Denali Brehmer, who killed her best friend for the promise of $9 million, among the most deeply unsettling true crime cases of the modern era, is one that unfolded in the summer of 2019 in the state of Alaska. A case that involves not only the betrayal of a close friendship for financial gain, but also the manipulation of a young person through a digital relationship built entirely on deception. Denali Dakota Sky Brehmer was 18 years old when she began communicating online with a man she knew only as Tyler. Tyler presented himself as a wealthy, handsome man from Kansas, with millions of dollars at his disposal, and a willingness to spend them generously on someone who would do what he asked. He sent Brehmer money through payment applications, escalating his requests over time, and establishing what investigators and psychologists would later describe as a classic pattern of online grooming through financial reward. The man was not who he said he was. His real name was Darren Schillmiller, and he was a 21-year-old man from New Salisbury, Indiana, who lived in his grandparents' basement and had no wealth of any kind. What Schillmiller offered Brehmer, through the persona of Tyler the Millionaire, was $9 million in exchange for committing a murder and sending him photographs and video documentation of it. This was not a vague or abstract proposition. According to court documents, the two had engaged in a series of escalating transactions and communications over the months preceding the crime, with Schillmiller making increasingly extreme demands in exchange for money, and Brehmer complying. By the time the plan for murder was fully formed, Brehmer had accepted the logic of it, that $9 million would arrive in exchange for carrying out what Schillmiller wanted. She began planning the crime and selected her victim. The person she chose was Cynthia Hoffman, who was 19 years old and who, according to court documents and statements from her family, considered Denali Brehmer to be her best friend. Cynthia Hoffman, known to those close to her as Cece, had a gentle and trusting nature. She had graduated from Service High School in 2018 and worked alongside her family on job sites, contributing in practical and meaningful ways to the family's livelihood. Her father described her as someone who worked hard, who was loyal, and who followed through on commitments. She had a learning disability that made academic achievement more difficult for her than for some of her peers, but she graduated, and her family was proud of her for it. She trusted Denali Brehmer. There was, as far as Cece Hoffman was concerned, no reason not to. In the days before June 2, 2019, Brehmer recruited 4 other teenagers to assist her, telling them that they would each receive a share of the $9 million she expected to receive. Among those recruited was Caden McIntosh, then 16 years old. 2 other participants were juveniles whose cases were handled through the juvenile court system. A 5th person, Caleb Leyland, then 19, provided a vehicle to transport the group to the location Brehmer had selected, a hiking trail area near Thunderbird Falls, a popular outdoor site just north of Anchorage along the banks of the Eklutna River. Brehmer arranged for Cynthia Hoffman to come along under the guise of a normal outing with friends, giving her no indication of what was planned. On the morning of June 2, 2019, Cynthia Hoffman went with people she trusted to a place she had no reason to fear. What happened there was documented in photographs and video, as Schillmiller had demanded. Cynthia was bound with duct tape, brought to the banks of the Eklutna River, and Caden McIntosh carried out the act that ended her life. Her body was placed into the river. She was 19 years old. She had been chosen as the victim specifically because her best friend had decided that her life was worth less than the money that had been promised in exchange for it. The photographs and video were sent to Schillmiller in Indiana, who had been monitoring the situation from his grandparents' basement the entire time. Cynthia Hoffman's father reported her missing the following day. Anchorage Police Department investigators launched a homicide inquiry and moved quickly. Within days, the investigation had identified the group involved, and arrests followed. Brehmer was arrested on June 9, 2019, at 18 years old. Schillmiller was identified and arrested in Indiana. The digital trail of communications between Brehmer and Schillmiller was extensive, and federal investigators became involved alongside the Anchorage Police Department's homicide unit. The evidence assembled against all parties was thorough. Cynthia Hoffman's body was recovered from the Eklutna River. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and involved multiple defendants in both state and federal jurisdictions. Darren Schillmiller faced federal charges in Indiana and was ultimately sentenced to 99 years in prison, the maximum available under the applicable statutes. Caden McIntosh was convicted of second-degree murder. Caleb Leyland was also convicted of related charges. The two juvenile participants were processed through the juvenile court system with their identities protected. As for Denali Brehmer herself, the person at the center of the entire scheme, the one who had known Cece Hoffman as a friend and had chosen her anyway, she spent nearly 4 years in the legal system before her case concluded. In February 2023, Brehmer entered a guilty plea to 1 count of first-degree murder, with additional charges of conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and solicitation dismissed as part of the agreement. The sentencing of Denali Brehmer took place over 3 days in January and February of 2024, before Anchorage Superior Court Judge Andrew Peterson. The hearing was emotionally intense. Prosecutors presented the full scope of the evidence, including the video documenting Cynthia Hoffman's final moments, footage that Judge Peterson later described as among the most difficult things he had been required to watch in his time on the bench. Cynthia's father delivered a statement about his daughter that described her as someone with a huge heart, someone who worked hard and did not ask for anything she had not earned. Assistant District Attorney Patrick McKay Jr. argued that whatever role the catfishing by Schillmiller had played, Brehmer was not a passive participant. She had recruited the group. She had selected the victim. She had chosen her best friend. None of that would have happened without Denali Brehmer. On February 12, 2024, Judge Peterson sentenced Denali Brehmer to 99 years in prison, the maximum the court was permitted to impose, with no credit for time already served. He described the murder as a premeditated contract killing that was, in his words, tragic and senseless, and noted that Brehmer had shown no remorse in the period following the crime and had continued engaging in further criminal conduct at Schillmiller's direction even after Cece was gone. The case of Denali Brehmer and Cynthia Hoffman has become a significant reference point in conversations about online manipulation, financial grooming, and the vulnerability of young people to sophisticated deception through digital platforms. Experts have pointed out that Schillmiller's methods, establishing a desirable persona, sending money to build trust and dependency, escalating demands gradually, and ultimately issuing an extreme ask, follow patterns that have been documented across various forms of online exploitation. What makes this case particularly difficult to process is that Brehmer was not simply a passive victim of manipulation. She made active choices at every stage. She chose to participate. She chose who the victim would be. She chose someone who called her a best friend. Cynthia Hoffman went to a waterfall with people she trusted on a summer morning in Alaska and never came home. Her father had to report his daughter missing to the police and then learn, over the course of an investigation, exactly what had happened and who was responsible for it. The $9 million that was promised never existed. It was never going to arrive. Darren Schillmiller had no money and never did. Cece Hoffman lost her life for a number that lived only in the imagination of a man in a basement in Indiana, transmitted through a screen to a teenager in Anchorage who decided it was enough. Number 4. Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer, who plotted to take a life for a trust fund. The case that became known around the world as the Bali suitcase murder is one of those true crime stories that contains so many layers of greed, deception, and betrayal that it is difficult, even after years of legal proceedings across 2 countries, to fully absorb all of it at once. At the center of the case are 2 young people from Chicago, Heather Mack, who was 18 years old at the time of the crime, and her boyfriend Tommy Schaefer, who was 21, and the sum of $1.5 million that Heather stood to inherit from a trust fund established in her name. Standing between Heather and that money, as the couple appears to have seen it, was one person, Sheila von Wiesemak, Heather's 62-year-old mother. Sheila was a wealthy Chicago socialite, the widow of a prominent jazz musician, and a woman with considerable assets and equally considerable opinions about the people in her daughter's life. She did not approve of Tommy Schaefer. This disapproval had created tension in the family for some time, and that tension had apparently reached a point in the summer of 2014 where Heather and Tommy had decided on a course of action that no amount of family conflict could ever justify. In August of 2014, Sheila von Wiesemak brought her daughter Heather to Bali, Indonesia, for a luxury vacation at the St. Regis Bali Resort. Tommy Schaefer joined them. According to the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, the plan to harm Sheila had been in development for months before the trip. Prosecutors in both Indonesia and the United States would later argue that Heather and Tommy had discussed and refined their intentions over an extended period, communicating their plans between themselves in specific terms. What they wanted was access to the trust fund. What stood in the way was Sheila's continued existence and her influence over the family finances and Heather's life decisions. On August 12, 2014, inside a room at the St. Regis Resort, Sheila von Wiesemak was attacked by Tommy Schaefer. She was 62 years old. She had brought her daughter on a holiday to a beautiful island. She had no opportunity to defend herself. What followed the attack was an attempt to conceal what had happened, that stands as one of the more extraordinary post-crime sequences in modern true crime history. Heather and Tommy placed Sheila's body inside a large suitcase. They arranged for a taxi to come to the hotel. When the taxi arrived, they managed to get the suitcase containing Sheila into the vehicle's trunk. Then, according to security footage that investigators would later review, the two simply walked away from the taxi, leaving the driver with a suitcase and an explanation that made no sense. The driver, understandably alarmed by the weight and condition of what he had been given to carry, alerted resort staff. The suitcase was opened. The body of Sheila von Wiesemak, 62 years old, was found inside. Heather Mack was a few weeks pregnant at the time. She and Tommy were arrested the following day. The Indonesian legal proceedings were swift by international standards. Both Heather and Tommy were tried separately before a 3-judge panel at the Denpasar District Court in Bali. The evidence against them was substantial, including security footage, forensic evidence from the hotel room, and the circumstances of the body's discovery. Tommy Schaefer testified at his own trial and acknowledged that an altercation had taken place, though he characterized it as self-defense in response to Sheila attacking him. The court found his account unconvincing. In 2015, both were convicted of premeditated murder. Tommy Schaefer received a sentence of 18 years from the Indonesian court. Heather Mack received a sentence of 10 years, with the panel granting her leniency on the grounds that she had recently given birth to a daughter, Stella, who the judges noted needed her mother. Inside the Indonesian prison, Heather was permitted to keep Stella with her until the child turned 2 years old. Heather Mack served approximately 7 years of her Indonesian sentence before being deported back to the United States in October 2021. Upon her arrival at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, federal agents were waiting for her. She was taken into custody immediately. The United States federal indictment against her and Schaefer charged them with conspiracy to commit murder in a foreign country, conspiracy to commit murder generally, and related offenses. Heather's daughter Stella, then approximately 6 years old, was taken into the care of a relative following a custody proceeding. In June 2023, Heather Mack appeared in federal court in Chicago before United States District Judge Matthew Kennelly and entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit murder, with her plea agreement capping her sentence at a maximum of 28 years. She was sentenced on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day, to 26 years in federal prison, with credit for approximately 2 years she had already spent in custody in Chicago. Her attorney noted the effective remaining sentence would be approximately 23 years. During the sentencing hearing, Bill Weiss, Sheila's brother and Heather's uncle, addressed the court and stated that Heather had never demonstrated genuine remorse for what had been done to his sister. He asked the judge to impose the maximum available sentence. Heather, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, sat largely impassive during the proceedings. She did not address the court in a manner that satisfied the family's desire for accountability. Judge Kennelly imposed the sentence, calling the crime heinous and noting that Heather's participation in the planning and execution of what happened to Sheila von Weissemack was not ambiguous. For his part, Tommy Schaefer completed his Indonesian sentence and was deported back to the United States in February 2026. He was immediately taken into federal custody in Chicago, where he faces the same federal charges. He has pleaded not guilty and intends to represent himself. As of the time of this video's production, his American case remains pending. Sheila von Weissemack was 62 years old. She had raised a daughter, built a life, and decided to take that daughter on a beautiful vacation. The suitcase that her body was found inside sat in a taxi trunk at one of Bali's most exclusive resorts, while the people responsible walked away from it and hoped no one would look inside. Number 5. Robert Durst, the real estate heir who silenced his closest confidant. Robert Durst was born into one of New York City's most powerful real estate dynasties. His family built and owned large portions of Manhattan, and Robert grew up with a level of inherited wealth that insulated him, throughout his life, from most of the ordinary consequences that govern human behavior. He was famously eccentric, famously reclusive, and by the time he reached middle age, famously connected to a series of disappearances and deaths that had shadowed him for decades without ever resulting in a conviction. He had managed, through a combination of wealth, legal resources, and the willingness of those around him to keep his secrets, to remain beyond the formal reach of the justice system for an extraordinarily long time. But one of those secrets, the one that ultimately put him in prison for the rest of his life, centered on a woman named Susan Berman, who had been his closest friend for decades, and whom he arranged to have silenced in December of the year 2000, because she knew too much about what had happened to his first wife, 18 years earlier. Susan Berman was the daughter of a Las Vegas organized crime figure, and she had met Robert Durst when they were both young, creative, ambitious people, moving in overlapping social circles. Their friendship deepened over the years into something that both of them appear to have valued genuinely. Susan walked Durst down the aisle at one of his weddings. He was present at major events in her life. They confided in each other across decades. But what Susan Berman knew, and what she had done with that knowledge, was the thing that made her a liability rather than simply a friend. When Durst's first wife, Kathy Durst, disappeared in 1982 under circumstances that investigators had always found suspicious, Susan Berman provided Robert Durst with what prosecutors argued was a fabricated alibi, telling investigators that she had spoken to Kathy after the point at which Robert had last claimed to have seen her. Whether Susan had done this knowingly or had been misled by Durst about the circumstances was something prosecutors would explore over the course of decades of investigation. What mattered, in the end, was what Susan knew and what she had been asked to do with that knowledge. By the year 2000, the investigation into Kathy Durst's disappearance had been reopened by New York authorities. Investigators were preparing to speak with Susan Berman, whose account of her conversations with Kathy in 1982 had become a significant point of interest. Susan knew the investigators were coming. According to the prosecution's case, Robert Durst also knew they were coming, and he understood that if Susan spoke honestly with the police about what she did or did not know, the consequences for him could be severe. In December of 2000, just before she was scheduled to cooperate with investigators, Susan Berman was found in her Los Angeles home. She had been shot at close range, in the back of the head. She was 55 years old. She was found in her own home, alone, by a friend who had come to check on her. The case went unsolved for 15 years. During those 15 years, Robert Durst continued to live the extraordinary life of a man who existed in the margins of enormous wealth while engaging in increasingly erratic and troubling behavior. He was acquitted of killing a neighbor in Galveston, Texas in 2003, in a case that drew national attention partly because Durst himself admitted to dismembering the individual's body and disposing of the remains, while arguing that the act itself was in self-defense. He jumped bail. He disguised himself. He lived under assumed names. He was arrested in New Orleans in 2015 on the eve of the broadcast of the final episode of an HBO documentary series about his life called The Jinx, in which filmmakers had confronted him with a handwritten note that was effectively a piece of self-incriminating evidence in the Berman case. A note that Durst had written, which matched in structure and wording, a note that had been sent anonymously to police, directing them to Susan Berman's body. During the filming of The Jinx, Durst was caught on a live microphone in a bathroom, muttering to himself in a way that prosecutors would later argue constituted a confession. The trial of Robert Durst for the first-degree murder of Susan Berman was among the most closely watched criminal proceedings in American legal history. It was delayed repeatedly, initially due to procedural matters and later due to the onset of the global pandemic and Durst's rapidly deteriorating health. By the time the trial finally concluded, Durst was 78 years old, confined to a wheelchair, and in serious physical condition. The prosecution presented a case built around the note, around Durst's own statements during the Jinx documentary, around the pattern of conduct that connected the Berman case to the broader context of his life, and around the financial and personal motive to silence a woman who could have exposed him. The defense argued that Durst had not been present when Susan died, that others could have had reason to wish her harm, and that the case against him was built on circumstantial evidence, amplified by a documentary that had been edited to suggest guilt. On September 17, 2021, a Los Angeles County jury, composed of 9 women and 3 men, deliberated for just over 7 hours, across 3 days, before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. The jury also found true the special circumstances of lying in wait and killing a witness. On October 14, 2021, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Mark Windham sentenced Robert Durst to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for the conviction. Judge Windham described the case and the evidence against Durst in clear terms, addressing the quality of the proof and the nature of what had been done to Susan Berman, who had spent the last years of her life in financial difficulty and had relied on Durst's support at various points. She had, in the judge's assessment, been an extraordinary person, adventurous, creative, deeply loyal. She was also, according to the prosecution's account, killed by the person she had been most loyal to, because that loyalty had outlived its usefulness to him. Robert Durst died in the California prison system on January 10, 2022, from causes associated with the series of serious medical conditions his attorneys had been documenting throughout the trial. He had maintained his innocence to the end. The jury had not believed him. Number 6. Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt, the best friends who ran a murder for insurance scheme in Los Angeles. There are criminal partnerships that stretch the imagination precisely because of the gap between what the participants appeared to be and what they actually were. Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt were 2 elderly women living in the Los Angeles area, Golay in Santa Monica, Rutterschmidt in Hollywood, who had developed a close friendship over many years. To the people around them, they presented the image of a pair of older women navigating the challenges of later life together. They went to the same places, they shared information, and they operated as a unit in their social dealings. They were, in every outward appearance, an entirely unremarkable pair of senior citizens. What investigators eventually discovered, after a painstaking process that connected 2 deaths 7 years apart, was that Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt were running one of the most methodically premeditated financial crime schemes in the documented history of California, a scheme that required them to cultivate relationships with vulnerable people, invest time and money in those relationships with careful patience, and then arrange for the people they had befriended to die in staged accidents so that they could collect on the insurance policies they had secretly taken out on those people's lives. The scheme worked as follows. Golay and Rutterschmidt identified homeless men in the Hollywood area, particularly around a church that served free meals to people without housing. They approached these men with offers of assistance, a place to stay, food, stability, and apparent kindness. For a man living on the streets of Los Angeles with no resources, this kind of offer represented genuine relief. The women installed their chosen individuals in studio apartments, paying the rent and covering the basic costs of their lives. While doing so, they also quietly obtained signatures from these men on forms and paperwork, telling them whatever was necessary to secure that cooperation. Using those signatures, and in some cases using rubber stamps fabricated from those signatures, Golay and Rutterschmidt applied for life insurance policies, naming themselves as beneficiaries. They listed themselves variously as fiancés, relatives, or business partners, depending on what each insurance application required. Over time, they accumulated a significant number of policies on each man. Prosecutors estimated that the two women collectively took out more than 24 separate policies tied to their victims. There was a calculation embedded in this plan that speaks to its premeditation. Life insurance policies typically contain a contestability clause, a period, usually 2 years, during which the insurance company can investigate and challenge a claim. By housing their victims and maintaining the appearance of a genuine relationship, Golay and Rutterschmidt were ensuring that the policies would mature past that contestability window before they acted. They were waiting, patiently and deliberately, for the financial conditions to be right. Once those conditions were met, they arranged for each man to die in what appeared, to first responders, to be a hit-and-run accident in a secluded Los Angeles alleyway in the early morning hours. The similarities between the two incidents, the location, the timing, the lack of witnesses, the circumstances of the injuries, are what eventually drew the attention of law enforcement. The first victim was Paul Vados, a 73-year-old Hungarian immigrant who had fallen into homelessness and had been taken in by the two women in the late 1990s. He was found in an alley near North La Brea Avenue in Hollywood in November of 1999. His death was initially investigated as a hit-and-run, and no perpetrators were identified. Golay and Rutterschmidt subsequently filed insurance claims on his behalf and collected approximately $600,000. The second victim was Kenneth McDavid, a 50-year-old man from Northern California who had also found himself without housing and had been similarly taken in by the two women between 2002 and 2003. Kenneth McDavid was found in an alley in the Westwood area in June of 2005. His death also appeared, at first, to be a hit-and-run. The connection between the two cases was made by a detective who overheard a colleague describing McDavid's case and recognized the structural similarities to the Vados case from 1999. Both cases featured the same two women claiming close personal relationships with the deceased. Both cases involved deaths in secluded alleys. Both involved substantial insurance policies that had been in place for more than 2 years. The investigation that followed was painstaking and thorough. Golay and Rutterschmidt were arrested in August of 2006 on initial charges of insurance fraud, while the murder investigation continued to develop. The case against them was built through a combination of financial records, insurance documentation, witness accounts, the testimony of a man named Jimmy Covington who had been approached by the two women and had eventually walked away when he became suspicious, and a surveillance video that captured Golay using her auto club membership to arrange the towing of a vehicle within minutes of Kenneth McDavid's death. DNA evidence connected that vehicle to the scene. In a moment that became one of the most widely reported details of the case, investigators secretly recorded a conversation between Golay and Rutterschmidt in a holding area following their arrest, during which Rutterschmidt berated Golay for taking out too many insurance policies, calling her greedy, and telling her that the volume of claims was what had ultimately attracted attention. The two women who had worked together with extraordinary patience and coordination for years were now blaming each other in a recorded conversation that would be played for the jury. The trials of Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt proceeded separately on certain counts, but were ultimately consolidated, with the jury rendering verdicts across an extended period in April of 2008. Helen Golay was convicted first. on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder for financial gain. The special circumstances that would make life without parole the applicable sentence rather than a lesser term. Olga Rutterschmidt's jury was initially deadlocked on some of her counts before returning with guilty verdicts across all charges. Both women were convicted. On July 15, 2008, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge David Wesley sentenced both Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt to 2 consecutive life terms each, without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, Judge Wesley addressed the 2 women directly, noting that the men they had chosen as victims had come to them seeking only the most basic human necessities: food, shelter, stability, and had trusted that what was being offered to them was genuine. The judge described those men as having been sacrificed, in his words, on the altar of greed. The California Supreme Court later upheld the convictions and sentences in their entirety. Paul Vados and Kenneth McDavid had survived on the streets of Los Angeles. They had accepted what appeared to be a hand extended in compassion. The compassion was a performance staged to serve a financial calculation, and they paid with their lives. Number 7. Natasha Cornett and her companions, who took a family's lives for a van and whatever was inside it. The road from Pikeville, Kentucky, to New Orleans is a long one, and for a group of 6 young people who left their small Appalachian town in the spring of 1997, it was a road that ended before they ever got close to where they were going. Natasha Leanne Cornett was 18 years old, and she was the acknowledged center of a group of teenagers and young adults who shared in varying degrees her sense of disconnection from the community around them. She had grown up in conditions of poverty and instability in rural Pike County, had left school before completing 9th grade, and had, by the time she reached adulthood, developed a self-image shaped significantly by alienation and resentment. The group that formed around her, Karen Howell, 17, Crystal Sturgill, 18, Joseph Risner, 20, Dean Mullins, 19, and Jason Bryant, 14, were in different ways all struggling people, young and underprepared for the lives they found themselves living. On April 6, 1997, the 6 of them got into a car together and drove out of Pikeville with an idea that had been floating among them: find a better vehicle, get to New Orleans, and start over. The car they had was an unreliable Chevrolet Citation belonging to Joseph Risner. It was not going to make it to Louisiana. They knew that, and they had already discussed, according to testimony from the proceedings that followed, the possibility of taking a different vehicle from someone they encountered along the way. The Lillelid family were not from Kentucky. They were not from anywhere near the world that Cornett and her companions occupied. Vidar Lillelid was 34 years old, originally from Norway, and had built a life in Knoxville, Tennessee, with his wife Delphina, who was 28 years old, and their 2 children, Tabitha, who was 6, and Peter, who was 2. The family were members of a religious community, and on April 6, 1997, they were returning from a church event when they stopped at an interstate rest area in Greene County, Tennessee, on Interstate 81. It was there that the 2 groups encountered each other. The Lillelids were a family with a minivan, exactly the kind of reliable vehicle that Cornett's group wanted. The conversation that began at the rest stop escalated in a direction that the Lillelid family could not have anticipated. According to testimony, members of Cornett's group approached the family under the pretense of engaging in religious conversation, specifically because Vidar's religious background made him open to such a discussion. The encounter moved from the rest stop area to the minivan, and then it moved to the minivan being driven somewhere off the main road, with the Lillelid family inside it and Cornett's group in control. On a remote road in Greene County, the situation reached its conclusion. Vidar Lillelid was 34 years old. Delphina Lillelid was 28. Tabitha Lillelid was 6. Peter Lillelid, who was 2 years old, was shot but survived, the only surviving member of his immediate family. He was left at the scene by the group as they departed in the Lililid's van, taking with them the family's passports and other belongings. The van was the primary motive. What money or valuables were on the family were secondary. The theft of a vehicle and whatever it contained had been weighed against the lives of a family that included a 6-year-old child and a 2-year-old toddler, and the group had proceeded anyway. Peter Lililid, 2 years old and wounded, was found alive. He survived and would grow up without his mother, his father, or his sister, carrying the physical and psychological weight of what had happened at that remote roadside in Tennessee. The van, the passports, and the other stolen items were recovered. Cornett and her companions were apprehended 2 days later, on April 8, 1997, after law enforcement tracked them across state lines. They were taken into custody in Arizona. All 6 were transported back to Tennessee to face charges. Because of the ages of some members of the group, most significantly Jason Bryant, who was only 14, the proceedings involved complex determinations about the applicable legal framework. Tennessee, like many states, maintains statutes that allow for serious charges to be brought against juvenile defendants in cases of this severity. All 6 ultimately entered guilty pleas. The legal proceedings that followed were extensive, involving hearings in multiple courts and negotiations over the terms of the pleas. Natasha Cornett entered her pleas on February 20, 1998. On March 25, 1998, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. All 5 of her co-defendants received equivalent sentences, life without parole, reflecting the court's assessment of the gravity of what had been done and the degree of participation that each individual had demonstrated. The case drew significant national media attention both at the time of the crime and during the legal proceedings, partly because of the youth of those involved and partly because of the sheer extremity of what had occurred. A family of 4, including 2 small children, targeted at a rest stop on an interstate highway by a group who wanted their vehicle. Peter Lililid survived. He is the only one who carries a direct, lived memory of what happened on that road. Natasha Cornett is currently incarcerated at the Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. Her companions are serving their equivalent sentences at various Tennessee correctional facilities. Vidar, Delphina, and Tabitha Lililid are buried in Knoxville. Number 8. Skylar Deleon, who lured a couple onto their own yacht and took everything Skylar Deleon had, by the age of his mid-20s, accumulated a personal history that those who later studied his case found both troubling and instructive. He had appeared briefly as a child actor, including a small role in a Power Rangers production, and had grown into an adult who was deeply in debt, unemployed, and facing the kind of financial desperation that, in his case, translated not into seeking legitimate help, but into constructing elaborate schemes to take what belonged to others. He had already, by late 2004, committed 1 murder in the service of financial gain, a killing that would only come to light as part of the broader investigation into what he did next. In November of 2003, he had met a man named John Jarvi, 45, of Anaheim, California, while both were participating in a work furlough program from a Seal Beach jail facility. Deleon had presented himself to Jarvi as a man with access to a lucrative investment opportunity, and Jarvi, who had limited financial resources but trusted what he was being told, had refinanced his condominium, his only significant asset, to raise $50,000, which he handed over to Deleon. Once Deleon had the money, he arranged to drive with Jarvi into Mexico. Jarvi's body was later found near a roadside outside Ensenada. Deleon had taken everything Jarvi had, then ensured that Jarvi could not report it. In November of 2004, Skylar Deleon was unemployed, living with his pregnant wife Jennifer, and deeply in debt. Thomas Hawks was 57 years old. Jackie Hawks was 47. They were a retired couple from Prescott, Arizona. Thomas had worked as a probation officer, who had decided that the time had come to spend their later years closer to family and in a simpler life than the one they had been living. To make that transition possible, they needed to sell their 55-foot yacht, which they had named the Well-Deserved. They listed the boat for sale at approximately $440,000 through an online advertisement. Skylar Deleon saw the listing. He and Jennifer discussed what they could do with a boat of that value, and according to testimony from investigators and witnesses, they developed a plan. Jennifer, who was visibly pregnant and had their young daughter with her, accompanied Skylar to the docks on an initial visit, presenting herself as part of a family unit interested in the purchase. The presence of a pregnant woman with a small child was, prosecutors argued, a deliberate element of the scheme, a way of making the Hawks feel at ease with the people expressing interest in their property. Deleon had recruited 2 other men to assist him. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a documented member of a Long Beach street gang. Alonzo McChain was a man with connections to Deleon through the Los Angeles area. On November 15, 2004, all of them, Deleon, Kennedy, and McChain, went aboard the Well-Deserved with Tom and Jackie Hawks for what the couple believed was a test cruise. Jennifer Deleon had their infant daughter with them. Once the yacht was out on the open water of Newport Harbor and the Pacific Ocean beyond, the situation changed. Tom and Jackie Hawks were overpowered. They were forced to sign documents transferring ownership of the yacht and granting power of attorney over their financial affairs to Skylar Deleon. Then they were bound and placed in the water. The bodies of Tom and Jackie Hawks were never recovered. The Pacific Ocean has no bottom that investigators can reach. On the way back to shore, according to testimony from McChain, the 3 men who had been on the boat divided the cash that had been on board, a few $1,000s in total, among themselves. Kennedy had gone fishing on the return trip. The Well-Deserved was subsequently cleaned thoroughly with bleach by Deleon and Jennifer, and efforts were made to access the Hawks' bank accounts and liquidate their assets. Those attempts to access the money triggered an investigation, and investigators quickly identified the Deleons as persons of interest. The case against Skylar Deleon, Jennifer Deleon, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Alonzo McChain was built over a period of years, drawing on financial records, witness testimony, including the full cooperation of McChain, and forensic evidence from the boat. Skylar Deleon's trial, which was consolidated to include the Jarvi murder as well as the Hawks murders, resulted in a verdict of guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances, including multiple murders and murder for financial gain. The jury deliberated and, after a penalty phase in which Deleon's attorneys openly conceded his guilt and asked only for leniency, recommended the death penalty. Deleon was formally sentenced to death by Orange County Superior Court Judge Frank Faisal on April 10, 2009. Jennifer Deleon was convicted separately and sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was also sentenced to death. Alonzo McChain received a sentence of 20 years in connection with his cooperation and role in the crimes. California's moratorium on executions means that Deleon and Kennedy, both formally sentenced to death, remain on death row at San Quentin with their sentences imposed but not carried out. Skylar Deleon has since legally transitioned gender and is now known as Skylar Preciosa Deleon. Tom and Jackie Hawks, who were simply selling their boat so they could spend more time with their grandchildren, were never found. Their son Ryan Hawks appeared at hearings and trial proceedings for years, advocating for accountability and speaking publicly about the irreplaceable loss of 2 people who, in his words, had done everything right. Number 9. Sante Kimes and Kenneth Kimes Jr., who destroyed a trusting friend to cover their fraud. If there is a defining characteristic of the criminal partnership between Sante Kimes and her son Kenneth Kimes Jr., it is the consistency of their willingness to use the people closest to them as instruments of financial schemes, and then to remove those people from the picture the moment they became inconvenient. Sante Kimes had been engaging in fraud, theft, and manipulation for decades by the time the case that would ultimately put her in prison came together in the late 1990s. She had a prior federal conviction from the 1980s relating to a scheme involving domestic workers she had exploited. She had a history of financial deception that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of victims. Her son Kenneth, whom she had raised and shaped in the image of her own values, had grown up inside this world and had become, by early adulthood, a capable participant in the schemes she designed. Together they operated as a unit, a mother who planned and directed, a son who executed her instructions. David Kasdan was a businessman in the Los Angeles area who had known the Kimes family for years. He was a friend of theirs, a man who had trusted them and had agreed, at Sante's request, to put his name on the deed to one of the family's Las Vegas properties as a favor, a way of helping manage assets during a complex financial period for the family. Kasdan had done this as an act of good faith toward people he considered friends. He did not realize, at the time, the degree to which his trust was being exploited. In November of 1996, Sante used Kasdan's name to take out a fraudulent loan of $280,000 from a bank, forging the necessary documents to make it appear that Kasdan had authorized the transaction. She received the money. Kasdan knew nothing about it until the bank began investigating the loan. When Kasdan discovered what had happened and raised the alarm, going to the bank and requesting an investigation, he had, in Sante Kimes' calculus, become a problem that needed to be resolved. In the spring of 1998, Kenneth Kimes Jr. traveled to David Kasdan's home in Los Angeles. According to Kenneth's own testimony, which he provided after negotiating a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, he arrived at Kasdan's door, and Kasdan, in the easy manner of someone receiving a visit from a familiar face, offered him coffee. What followed was the act that ended David Kasdan's life. Kenneth shot him at close range in the back of the head. He then arranged for the body to be placed in a trash receptacle near Los Angeles International Airport, where it was found by a homeless man shortly afterward. David Kasdan was a businessman and a father. He had extended genuine friendship to a woman who had repaid that friendship by stealing his identity for a fraudulent loan and then arranging for his death when he tried to address what she had done. The discovery of David Kasdan's body was the beginning of an investigation, but it was not the case that would first bring Sante and Kenneth Kimes to justice. That honor went to a crime committed in New York City in 1998, when the two targeted an 82-year-old socialite named Irene Silverman, who lived in a $7 million townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The Kimeses rented a room in Silverman's home under a false name and, according to prosecutors, developed a plan to steal the property by forging a deed and eliminating the owner. Irene Silverman disappeared, and her body was never found. When the Kimeses were subsequently arrested in Louisiana while driving with a stolen vehicle, investigators found in their possession an extraordinary collection of items: firearms, a knockout substance, plastic handcuffs, recordings of Silverman's phone conversations, and a notebook in which the scheme against Silverman had been documented in specific detail. They were tried in New York and convicted in 2000 on more than 100 counts. Sante Kimes received a sentence of 120 years. Kenneth received a sentence of 125 years. Neither would be eligible for parole until well into the next century. But the David Kasdan case had not gone away. California prosecutors pursued the investigation, and in 2003, Kenneth Kimes Jr. entered into a plea agreement in which he agreed to testify against his mother in exchange for prosecutors dropping the possibility of capital punishment in the Kasdan case. He described the killing in court in detail, explaining the sequence of events and his mother's instructions. Sante Kimes was tried in Los Angeles Superior Court on the charge of first-degree murder of David Kasdan, with special allegations that the crime had been committed for financial gain and to eliminate a witness. The jury convicted her in July 2004. On March 21, 2005, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell sentenced both Sante and Kenneth to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the Kasdan murder, sentences that were in addition to the enormous terms they were already serving in New York. The judge addressed the case directly, noting that while she believed Kenneth had been deeply manipulated and controlled by his mother throughout his life and had finally demonstrated some accountability by testifying, he still bore responsibility for what he had done. Sante Kimes died in prison in 2014. Kenneth Kimes Jr. remains incarcerated, serving out sentences that will keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. David Kasdan trusted a family he had known for years, and that trust was used against him in the most irreversible way possible. Number 10. Dellen Millard and Mark Smich, the best friends who planned a killing for a truck. There are crimes that reveal themselves to be the product, not of sudden impulse, but of sustained, deliberate planning. Crimes where the evidence assembled at trial demonstrates that two people sat together, discussed what they intended to do, made decisions about how to do it, acquired the tools and logistics they would need, and then carried it out with a degree of coordination that could only come from prior arrangement. The case of Dellen Millard and Mark Smich is exactly that kind of case, and what makes it particularly significant in the landscape of true crime is the specific nature of what they were willing to do, who they were willing to do it to, and the lengths to which they went afterward to conceal what had happened. The victim was a complete stranger to them, a 32-year-old father from Ancaster, Ontario, named Tim Bosma, who had simply listed his pickup truck for sale on an online advertisement. The motive was to steal the truck. The planning that surrounded the acquisition of that truck involved a scheme developed over more than a year, a specialized piece of equipment constructed specifically for the purpose of destroying evidence, and the direct participation of two people who had been close friends for years. Dellen Millard came from a background of considerable inherited wealth. His family had built a successful aviation business, and Millard had grown up with access to resources and properties that most people of his age could not imagine. He owned a farm near the town of Ayr in Ontario, and it was on that farm that he had installed, constructed in fact, at significant expense, a device that prosecutors would describe as an industrial incinerator, something that Millard himself had reportedly nicknamed the Eliminator. The existence of this device, and what it was ultimately used for, would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. Mark Smich was Millard's close friend, a man from Oakville, Ontario, who had been involved in drug dealing and who shared with Millard a willingness to operate outside the boundaries of the law. The two men had spent significant time together and were by all accounts genuinely close, in the way that people who engage in serious criminal activity together tend to develop bonds formed through shared risk and mutual dependency. In May of 2013, Tim Bosma and his wife Charlene were preparing for a new chapter in their lives as a family. Tim was a hard-working man who took pride in the practical things he built and maintained. He had a Dodge Ram pickup truck that he had decided to sell, and he listed it on an online marketplace, including contact details and photographs of the vehicle. It was a normal thing to do. People list vehicles for sale every day. On the evening of May 6, 2013, two men came to the Bosma home in Ancaster, responding to the listing, and asked if they could take the truck for a test drive. Tim Bosma went with them. Charlene Bosma watched her husband get into his own truck with two strangers and drive away. He did not come back. Over the following days, Charlene Bosma and Tim's family and friends searched for him, and Canadian law enforcement launched an investigation that moved with notable efficiency. Surveillance footage, phone records, and financial records allowed investigators to identify Dellen Millard and Mark Smich as the two men who had been with Tim Bosma on the night he disappeared. When investigators reached Millard's farm near Ayr, they found the Eliminator, and in the remains processed through that device, they found fragments of bone that were later identified through forensic analysis as belonging to Tim Bosma. He had been 32 years old. He was a father. He had gone on a test drive of his own truck, His body had been destroyed in an industrial incinerator that his killer had built on his property for exactly this kind of purpose. Tim Bosma's truck was subsequently found and recovered, stripped and hidden. The murder weapon was also located and connected to the crime. The trial of Dellen Millard and Mark Smich for the first-degree murder of Tim Bosma began in February 2016 in Hamilton, Ontario, and ran for approximately 4.5 months. It became the most closely watched criminal trial in Canada during that period, drawing sustained national media attention both for the nature of the crime and for the extraordinary behavior of the defendants in the courtroom. Both men attempted to place responsibility on the other. Mark Smich took the stand and testified that it was Millard who had acted and that his own role had been more limited. The defense lawyers for Millard presented an account that inverted this, suggesting that Smich had been the one who had carried out the decisive act. Prosecutors argued that this mutual blame was itself evidence of consciousness of guilt, and that the evidence clearly established a shared plan and shared execution of that plan. Charlene Bosma attended the trial every single day, through forensic testimony that was, by all accounts, extraordinarily difficult to hear, through legal arguments that stretched for weeks, through the experience of sitting in a courtroom while two men argued about who bore primary responsibility for killing her husband. She was there every day. On June 17, 2016, after 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned. Both Dellen Millard and Mark Smich were found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Tim Bosma. Under Canadian law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries an automatic sentence of life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Judge Andrew Goodman imposed those sentences hours after the verdicts were read. During the sentencing, the judge described Tim Bosma as an innocent, decent, and hard-working family man, and stated that what had been done to him was incomprehensible. Charlene Bosma addressed the court in a statement that was widely published and widely read, describing the void that Tim's absence had created in her life and in the life of the daughter they had been raising together. The case did not end with the Bosma verdicts. Both Millard and Smich were subsequently tried for the first-degree murder of a Toronto woman named Laura Babcock, who had gone missing in 2012 and whose remains had also been processed through the eliminator. Both were convicted of Babcock's murder as well. Dellen Millard was additionally tried and convicted of the first-degree murder of his own father, Wayne Millard, who died in 2012 under circumstances that had initially been characterized as a self-inflicted injury and were later reclassified as homicide following the evidence that emerged during the Bosma investigation. The Ontario Court of Appeal upheld the Bosma murder convictions in their entirety, dismissing all grounds of appeal raised by both defendants. Dellen Millard and Mark Smich are serving consecutive life sentences in the Canadian correctional system. Tim Bosma listed his truck for sale. He went on a test drive. He trusted that two men who had responded to an advertisement and shown up at his door were ordinary buyers. The eliminator on Millard's farm was constructed in advance, ready for use. The planning that preceded May 6, 2013, was not a matter of hours or days. It was a scheme built over more than a year by two men who had decided, together, that another person's life was worth less than the vehicle he was trying to sell.